Welcome to the Risk and Numbers podcast. I'm Greg Spicer, co-founder of Ostrich Cyber Risk. We launched this podcast to help professionals across information security, cyber risk, compliance, and C-suite executives, as well as board members, navigate cyber risk with more clarity and confidence. If you're looking to cut through the noise and make smarter decisions, you're in the right place. Each episode features real conversations with industry experts who understand the stakes, the frameworks, and most importantly, how to translate cyber risk into meaningful action. No fluff, just practical insights you can actually use. Today's guest is John Feezell, Director and CRQ Lead at Kyndryl Security and Resiliency Practice. John spent over 2 decades in security and systems between IBM, Kyndryl, and also time in the insurance industry, and is one of the most respected voices in cyber risk quantification. Simply put, he's someone who knows how to turn risk data into business action. With that said, let's dive into the conversation with John. Hello, thank you for joining the inaugural podcast. And very excited for an inaugural one to have our guest today, John Feezell. I've got the opportunity to work with John extensively over the last 3 years in cyber risk quantification. He's a valuable client of ours and extremely knowledgeable in the space. And with that, John, I'm going to give you just a few seconds here to tell us a little bit about yourself, why you are so esteemed in the space, and why you are excited about cyber risk quantification. So, John?
Well, Greg, thank you. It's always a pleasure when you and I can slow down for just a few minutes and have a discussion like this. Oftentimes, it's maybe once a year we sit down and have a cup of coffee. But thank you for having me on. Congratulations on your inaugural podcast. I'm honored to be part of that. So my name is John Feezell, and I'm an associate partner with Kyndryl, providing consulting services around risk and compliance, including Kyndryl's offerings around CRQ services. And just as a back note there, Kyndryl is about 3 years ago, we spun off from IBM, but I think people don't need to hear that anymore. Kyndryl's kind of made a name for itself now. I'm excited to be along for that journey as well. Greg, you asked me what excites me about cyber risk. And I think I have to say I cheated because I knew you were going to ask me that question. So I've been thinking about it. I'd have to say it's the opportunity to create force multipliers for good. And what that means to me is it's about the people. It's about the defenders, the decision makers, about training and equipping them. I think CRQ platforms like Ostrich, consulting services like Kyndryl provides, compliance frameworks, emerging tech, even especially AI, they all sit in my mind as enablers of those force multipliers. Can I train them? Can I consult with them? Can I equip them? Can I lead them to solutions and technologies that enhance their roles as advisors, defenders, and decision makers? So I think it's the people and those relationships. And that's what brings me back to the table every morning.
Yeah, that's good. And you are an excited person about this space, always encouraging people to get into it, dig into it from the very start. So for today, this leads us into what we want to talk about today, John, which is how do large enterprises prioritize cyber risk reduction based on using quantification, for example, like the FAIR ontology with tooling like Ostrich, not just from a maturity standpoint with the control frameworks, but now moving into actual risk quantification for business decisions. And that's what we're going to talk about today in the brief time we have together. Why do people struggle with this? Why do organizations struggle to get past this, John? I will say that in our experience at Ostrich, over the last 2 years, it's becoming less of a struggle, which is really good for both of us and our organizations. I think CISOs are now entering into the picture as opposed to just risk management teams. But still, there's that challenge of getting past the control framework, which is still important. We have that in the tooling. NIST, ISO, CIS, those are all important. But at the same time, to take it to the next level, quantification is critical. But why do they struggle?
I think the struggle is that they're part of the DNA of what we've been doing for the last decade and longer. And they provide a false sense of security to some teams. There's a perceived kind of a silver bullet for today's regulatory complexity. If you're anxious about things that are changing, this seems like a safe harbor. It's something that maybe a regulatory body has said, here's some controls and here's our recommended posture on them. It's flotsam in the water that you can grab hold of. But I think there are sharks in the water. And I think whether you're holding on to that or not, there are still risks that you need to defend against. And I think there's another piece of this as well. When somebody prescribes for you a checklist, which is what a lot of these are, is basically a checklist, and you're able to check that off. So I don't know if you've ever done this, Greg, but I sometimes I'll have a ton of things to do on a Saturday, and I'll make checklists, and I put little boxes. I'm stupid. I put little boxes on the side so I can put that little check mark in, and I will even write in something that I've already done and put a check mark there so that
Absolutely.
I get credit. No, my wife's not even going to see this, but I get credit. And you know what happens? The scientists tell us that when you do that, it releases dopamines in your brain. There's a for that this releases. And I think there's some element of this as well with regards to checking that list. I'm adherent to this security framework. I've made it, right? But again, to the picture of the flotsam in the water, you're hanging on. You may not be drowning, but buddy, there's sharks right under that water. So there's more work to do.
Yeah. And I think with that, I think one of the things that is great about doing risk quantification is the idea of not only program management. We always tell people, so certainly, and now as people are maturing in the space, program management is great, right? Prioritization, we'll talk about that in a minute here. And the other thing, though, is obviously the reporting piece and having this now become a business decision. Cybersecurity is a business decision, not just as a technical protection decision, which is still critical, obviously, but they interact, right? And I think that one of the things that makes this even more compelling is the idea that now the risk team or the information security team has a seat at the table with other executives who aren't in that space, but understand the business aspects. And when you start talking in financial terms, it makes a difference. It makes an incredible difference. And especially now with the heat and light that are being put on CISOs that maybe wasn't there a few years ago as far as responsibility, it gives them a sense of, okay, I'm doing this and I'm being blessed, if you will, by the board or by the C-suite and so forth. And when it comes to that from the program standpoint, how does this help with prioritization and how is it done right, in your opinion?
That's a great question and some really important observations there. I'll circle back and double click on one of the things you just said. But let's go back to basics for just a moment. And what is the purpose of prioritization? So as we're needing to prioritize, what are our outcomes going to be? So we have limited resources. This could be personnel time, it could be funding, and we need to allocate those things in an intelligent and defensible way, right? We're going to have to defend those decisions. Hopefully not after a disaster. We're going back and defending what we did, but we always need to build our decision-making with the idea that we may sit in front of a court somewhere, whether it be a real court or a court of our peers, and defend why did we make that decision. We've also got this whole idea of these emerging risks they're happening so fast now. Come into work tomorrow morning, there's going to be another 0 day, there's going to be another ransomware campaign, there's going to be another CVE or piece of technical debt that you've been carrying in your organization that now appears on the Kev list for CISA or something like that. Now we have no vulnerabilities. It's different from yesterday. And so we have to navigate that landscape. That requires prioritization. We've got, as you mentioned, the overarching business objectives. And I had something that changed the way I look at business objectives. I had a mentor in cybersecurity. This was a general manager in IBM when I was with IBM. And he always had open on his desktop the latest stockholder report. And every day he would be reading some about that stockholder report because he said it aligned everything he did with the objectives of the business. And those are most purely crystallized in that stockholder. That's what we're telling our stockholders our goals are, what our risks are, what our objectives are for this quarter. So everything needs to be prioritized according to the business, not even talking about cyber, but those business objectives. And across all of these things, and you mentioned this, was decision making and informing that decision, those decisions, making them defensible. And you mentioned at the board level. So if you've got all of these folks, including the CISO, and they're all speaking different languages, one's Japanese, one's German, and they don't understand each other, they can all be talking and nothing is happening. There's no prioritization, there's no decision making happening, there's no good comparisons. And so there has to be a common language. And you mentioned the common language is dollars over time. And so that's the power of CRQ and prioritization within CRQ for the CIO, for the CISO, is that they get to go to that table now and speak in that language in a defensible way. And now their stuff, their priorities, their needs are able to be now prioritized, not within their organization, but within the entire business, standing side by side with legal risk and other opportunities and marketing, brand risk, all of these other things that are needing to happen under the light of the business objectives, the overarching things that need to happen within the business. And so it really brings our cybersecurity experts to the table in ways that haven't been done before. And that's what I think good prioritization looks like. It's not, are you prioritized within your little organization? It's how are your elements being prioritized across the broader organization? Because cybersecurity under the covers, like that shark, it's there. Everybody's in the water, and you are the defender against that shark.
Yeah, you mentioned defensible, and that's, I think, one of the areas in risk quantification that has been the question mark for people. And we use the open fair ontology within our tooling. We use, as an example, NIST CSF on the control side. That's defensible, right? These are defensible metrics that you can actually stand behind based off of using these industry standards, which is really critical. So I just want to make that point. I think that's been part of the drawback for folks, is the idea that, where do I get my data? Is it defensible? And we won't get into that today. That might be a good follow-up one, but just why risk quantification done properly is defensible. And you can answer the questions that somebody from finance or legal will ask, because you do have defensible data and input, which is really critical. Listen, let's move on. Where do you see, and I think I know where you're going with this, but where do you see quantification as providing the biggest lift to an organization? Where does this make maybe the biggest impact, or the biggest, maybe not an impact, but turn the ship a little for a better direction?
I think there's two applications of CRQ. One is almost, you could think of it like a surgical instrument. One thing is, I've brought students across the line and I've seen the light bulb turn on with regards to the open fair methodology, CRQ. Once that thing sparks for them, they want to go out and apply that everywhere. They're excited. They see the power of it. They see the defensibility of it. But there's a little bit of overhead attached to that as well. And so reining them back a little bit is something I do as well. And I speak to them in terms of a surgical instrument. So this could be used to inform like a decision that has to be made between the purchase of two different controls, or the prioritization of that purchase. Which control can we buy this year and which control are we going to implement next year? Or if you're on a zero trust journey, that whole journey is a set of forks in the road that you need to maintain based on where your business needs to go. And so that's where that surgical aspect of cyber risk quantification can really bring that. But I think also when it's done right, and when I mean done, you mentioned the open fair standards as maintained by the open group. That standard, and not a black box, that's doing it. And then also, you mentioned that there was data and the defensibility of the data. So what data? Do you have solid data and threat intelligence? With those three elements, I think there's another heavy hitter here, and that's continuous modeling.
Yes.
There are platforms that do that, and it can be a great equalizer, not against two different things where you have to make a unique decision among this control or this control, but where you might be managing 5,000, for example, third parties, and you have to decide today, where are my resources who's the problem child today, right? CRQ can bring light to that in a continuous modeling sense, if you have the data, if you have the platform, and so forth. So I think there's two aspects there, and those two items are where I see the biggest lift.
Yeah, I think you mentioned a good point. We just were talking to somebody who's about to license our app, and they were saying that they actually had to push back a little because senior management got so excited about this. They wanted to start doing it in a broad spectrum of things. And to your point, a little bit, we got to take a step back and be a little more surgical about this. And I think they were excited. The risk team was excited because they're like, okay, we succeeded in getting buy-in. Now we need to manage expectations of buy-in. And that's a good problem to have.
Exactly.
You know what? There's a lot of surprises that come up with doing this type of work. And as people dig in, there's things that they expected, but there's also things that they didn't expect. And that's the beauty of this, is it's opening eyes to things that we may not have intended to see or thought we'd see. So what are some of the surprises? You're doing this work from more of a consultative standpoint. Maybe for you, what has been some big surprises, or maybe even for some of your clients?
That's also a great question, Greg. And I think I've seen some things as I've been in my travels, I should say, that basically our society and our culture and maybe even our education system generally leaves us ill-equipped to deal in this world of probabilistic modeling. And this is a piece that you as a practitioner, and I would venture a guess as a consumer or defender, so at a CIO and CISO level, you need to understand this as well. What's the engine that's humming under the covers here, under the hood, for this probabilistic modeling? And this also impacts the acceptance of CRQ and the results out of a CRQ modeling exercise. And I see this affect what I would consider otherwise highly educated people. Their brain isn't bent that way. And so that's one of the things that I've had to overcome. It's been a little surprising to me, but I've found some levers that help people to do that. So I'm going to rattle off a couple of, I promise I don't get any kickbacks from any of these authors, but there are some books out there that I would really recommend. And in this case, How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk will shake your world. It will start to change that. And then there's a unique book that's not a cyber risk book at all. It's called Thinking in Bets. And it's by a gal named Annie Duke. And Greg, our common friend, Jack Whitsett, put me onto this a couple of years ago. And I bought the audio of it, and I've listened to it like 4 times. I need to listen to it again. It really helps your brain to understand that probabilistic modeling. And so I think those operating in the realm need to unlearn some things that are probably second nature now to all of us, and also bend our brains to this new critical thinking approach. That's what's been surprising, is that it's a little bit of brain surgery before you even start to talk about gathering data and munging numbers.
Yeah, that's a good point. And as we wrap this up, I'm one of those people that, and I've had to do that myself, because I want something that's concrete, something that's, this is what's going to happen if you do this or if you don't do this. And risk one is not that at all. It is an estimation, not a predictor, but an estimator. And your goal is to get as accurate as possible. And with this, one of the things that we see is, how do we get started? And I'm a practical guy, right? When I lead these types of podcasts, or I'm speaking at a conference or interviewing experts such as yourself, I'm like, okay, that's great. And I've gotten to know you well over the years, and you're a big thinker and so forth. For the person or that executive, the CISO, or somebody in InfoSec or even risk management who needs tangible results, like in terms of, how do I get started? What do I do? What do I use? Who do I talk to? What kind of advice can you give them to get started in this journey?
I think the first thing is, don't try to do it by yourself. Get some help. There are some free tools that are available just to get you started, to get that brain bend starting to happen. There's an Excel tool from the Open Group that you can download for free. Then there's a SaaS platform from the FAIR Institute. And both of those versions, they're freely usable for education and non-commercial modeling. I know this is an ostrich podcast, and I work for Kyndryl. You can come to us for help. There are many venues to get that help, but do get help. Don't try to do this alone. Get a hold of the proper tooling, and eventually something for your tooling to use data feeds and threat intelligence feeds that are coming in. This is key, because it's going to make your life much easier. And then finally, I think I'd say, start surgically. Think small. Start small, build a small success, and then build another one on top of it. And along the way, capture an executive sponsor within your organization. This is going to be important because
that is important. That's really
you're going to have to
important.
win hearts and minds. You're going to have to bend those brains, right? And so this executive sponsor can catch that vision, bend his brain first or her brain first. They'll catch the vision, but then they can provide help and overwatch while you're building out your program. That's what I would say to get started.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm excited. Obviously, we're in this space, both of us together in our organizations. And I'm excited because people are now wanting to get into it and they're curious enough to consider it. And then once you start, if you have the right people speaking to them and educating them, they begin to say, okay, yeah, this is something I want to delve into. I think as time progresses, and we've seen this just over the years, is the interest and it's not a nice to do. It's something I think we need to do as an organization, is what a CISO would say or a head of risk would say. So I think that's great.
Mm-hmm.
So in conclusion, John, why don't you give us some takeaways? If I was to listen to this podcast and for the first time hear about this, other than what I've read in LinkedIn or seen on websites and so forth, what are some of the key takeaways that you would want to have as somebody who's listening to this for the first time or hearing this for the first time?
Sure thing. So I think to sum everything we've talked about today up, I'd say that you as a cyber defender or manager of cyber defenders, you're being driven to this ever increasing regulatory just swamp, and also this ever changing threat horizon. But at the same time, your spending is probably either being suppressed or you're having to clear higher and higher hurdles of justification or ROI analysis to get the funding that you need for the resources. And so I think an appropriate balance of qualitative and quantitative approaches, and you mentioned this, Greg, NIST CSF and CRQ, not or, but and.
Amen to that.
Right?
Amen to that.
And so that has the potential to raise your needs and those ensuing discussions to new levels of credibility, and thus gain that traction that's necessary to have those C-level conversations, that C-level allocations to meet your organizational, I would even say regulatory challenges head on. So start small, dip your toe in the water. There are organizations like Kyndryl and Ostrich that can help you along, but don't wait, start now. I think there's a saying that says the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. And right, the second best time is right now. So if you've been thinking about this for a while, or if you feel like you're late, you're not. Get in the water, get it, start it now, plant the tree now, and we're here to help.
John Feezell, always great to talk to you, and appreciate you spending time with us today on our inaugural podcast for Ostrich Cyber Risk. And we look forward to doing many more of these, and certainly we'll have you back, John.
All right.
And with that, thank you again for approaching this with us, and look forward to our continued conversations, both on podcasts and, of course, with clients. So thank you very much, sir.
Great. Thank you, Greg. It's always a pleasure.